Hello, we're reconvening for our CEDAW hearings and welcoming Jessica Williams. So please, Jessica, do go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here and to be able to give this witness statement. Thank you. So my witness statement and the evidence I'm giving will relate to Article 2 of CEDAW with a focus on subsection G in relation to incarcerated women. I have annexed 19 pieces of supporting evidence for this witness statement. My background, I am 40 years of age and my background is as follows. I was incarcerated in the United States of America when I was 16 and 17 years old in various jails and in 2 prisons, the first being a maximum security prison and the latter being a minimum security prison. As an adult, I have been a researcher and a political lobbyist for the last 7 years, focusing on the rights of incarcerated women since 2020. I have since conducted hundreds of hours of research pertaining to Australian legislation and corrective services policies, as well as international, national, and state penal standards. I lead the Australian peak body for the sex-based rights of incarcerated women and girls, and I am the founder of the International Network for the Rights of Incarcerated Girls and Women. I first became involved and aware of the difficulties facing women in this area by being an ex-incarcerated woman. I learned more by being incarcerated about being a woman in prison than anyone can ever learn from the text on pages or a secondhand testimony. Due to being a community activist for many years, I have been aware of concerning policies and practices used against women in Australian prisons since I relocated to Australia in 2010. Through research, I have learned of other very concerning changes to corrective services and corrections policies and to national and state legislation and policy since 2020. Through media interviews, advocacy, and political lobbying over the last several years, I have become connected with many people and organizations within different communities and on every level of government. Question number 6, how has Australia's implementation of its obligations pursuant to CEDAW improved since it first adopted CEDAW in 1980, and what has improved for women in the last 50 years and what has become worse? In relation to incarcerated women, very little has improved. Much has worsened in the last 50 years. A, strip searches. Despite research that states while strip searches are normalized within prison, prisoners, especially female prisoners, experience them as a form of sexual violence or coercion. Outside of the prisoner-prison officer relationship, the coerced removal of clothes would constitute sexual assault. George, 1993. Despite international calls to cease strip searches and body cavity searches, despite advocate research and submissions which state, quote, as a population with one of the highest rates of physical and sexual victimization, women in prison can find the process of strip searching especially traumatizing. In many ways, strip searches replicate the dynamics of abuse by incorporating elements of coercion, degradation, and invasion of personal privacy. For women who have been victims of abuse, the process can be unbearable as they are once again placed in a position of helplessness and lack of control, end quote. Despite knowing that women prisoners suffer concerning rates of traumatic brain injury and acquired brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, other mental health issues and depression, and that women prisoners have histories of suffering physical and or sexual assault, and that many women prisoners have suffered child sexual assault. Despite knowing that women make more attempts at self-harm while in prison than men do, strip searching in Australia continues and, in fact, is a very serious problem. Hundreds of incarcerated women are being searched every year, and some of these women are being searched multiple times. Quote, new data reveals that 841 strip searches of women in Tasmanian prisons took place in a 7-month period, with only 3 failing the search. The figures obtained by the Human Rights Law Centre under a right to information request revealed the data for the period between October 2020 and April 2021. The documents show that only 3 searches turned up concealed items. Those concealed items were pain medication, tobacco and a lighter, and tobacco and matchsticks. The Human Rights Law Centre says, quote, Tasmanian prisons searches conducted too frequently, not in line with international standards. We know that Aboriginal women are strip searched at alarmingly higher rates than other women prisoners. B, consistency, transparency, and record keeping. Making this already serious problem much, much worse is a lack of record keeping, inconsistency between facilities, and other poor methods and practices. In 2021, Freedom of Information responses revealed that New South Wales Corrections does not record strip searches of women prisoners. Quote, the Human Rights Law Centre submitted a Freedom of Information request to Corrective Services New South Wales for the records of strip searches on women in prison between October 2020 and April 2021. In response, the agency said that there are no registers or logbooks where the searches are recorded, end quote. As stated in a 2019 report on strip searching practices in Western Australian women's prisons, quote, the department has imposed limits on strip searching at 3 women's prisons, the privately operated Melaleuca Remand and Reintegration Facility, Boronia Pre-Release Centre, and Wandoo Rehabilitation Prison. However, it has not imposed any such limitations at the main publicly operated women's prison, Bandiap, or at mixed gender regional prisons, some of which had high rates of strip searching. Therefore, practices with respect to the strip searching of women depend more on location than risk, end quote. Significantly, they found that the reduction in strip searching at the prisons did not lead to an influx of drugs. A 2019 investigation into the operation of Freedom Information laws shows that the refusal of Freedom of Information requests is at its highest level since records began in 2010-11. C, incarceration rates. In 1988, there were 116 women in prison, an increase of 446% from the mid-70s. Male imprisonment had increased only 11% over this same period of time. It is noted that Australia-wide, female incarceration increased by 217% over this time. This increase was not attributable to rising crime rates, but to the deteriorating economic position of women. Further, 36% of women in prison had a maximum security rating compared with 31% of men, although they did not commit the same level of serious offenses. Women were 40 times more likely to be imprisoned for fine default, for instance, than men. Although women and girls make up just 8% of the total prison population in Australia, the female prison population increased 64% between 2009 and 2019, while the male prison population grew by 45%. A report from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, published in November 2020, states, quote, although women make up a relatively small proportion of the total prison population in Australia, over the past 10 years, the number of women in prison has been increasing and at a faster rate than the number of men in prison. These trends echo international growth in the rate of women being incarcerated. The AIHW report also states, quote, the number of females in prisons worldwide increased by around 53% between mid-2000 and mid-2016. This growth in the female prison population cannot be explained by global population growth or total prison population growth. However, data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics states that from 30th of June 2021 to 30th of June 2022, female prisoners decreased by 10% to a total of 2,977. This decrease could be correlated to legislation to end imprisonment for unpaid fines, but this is speculation. And although this is not included in my written statement, I would like to put on record that this could also be correlated to the lockdowns from COVID, but that is also speculation. D, privatization incentivizing incarceration. Australia has the highest proportion of inmates in private prisons of any nation, at around 17%. Quote, heavy reliance on and investment in private prisons has failed to achieve positive community outcomes, and this is proven by increasing incarceration rates around Australia since the 1980s. Another quote, The Australian prison system is being increasingly privatised, and this has direct implications on reoffending rates, as private providers are being made responsible for recidivism outcomes, despite the fact they may also retain incentives to keep people within prisons. Question 7. How has Australia's implementation of its obligations pursuant to CEDAW improved since its last report back to CEDAW in 2018? What has improved over the past 5 years for women, and what has gotten worse? In relation to the CEDAW list of issues and questions prior to the submission of the 9th Periodic Report of Australia, Women in Detention, 23, subsection G, or point G, sorry, women's conditions of detention and whether they are in conformity with the United Nations rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, the Bangkok Rules, and the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, also known as the Nelson Mandela Rules. In relation to this, A, there is no accountability within government. There is no accountability or responsibility taken by state or federal politicians. Federal government handballs concerns relating to this issue to the states, while rejecting calls for Australian penal policy or relevant legislation, guidelines, etc., to reflect those earlier mentioned international standards, the Bangkok Rules and the Nelson Mandela Rules. No federal human rights instrument is focused solely or even largely on women in prison. Then the state governments reject calls for consistency within particular national standards, for example, CEDAW via Sex Discrimination Act 1984, by pointing to other national standards, for example, the Australian government guidelines on the recognition of sex and gender. In correspondence with state and federal politicians, which I have supplied, from over the last few years, elected leaders of Australia have stated that states are not bound by or required to meet standards set forth in the Bangkok Rules or Nelson Mandela Rules. They instead point to the 7 core UN treaties to which Australia is a signatory, all of which are dangerously inadequate regarding the rights of women prisoners. B, breaches of women's human rights. Every state has at least one penal policy or piece of legislation that breaches the provisions within Bangkok Rules and Nelson Mandela Rules and CEDAW, and by extension Sex Discrimination Act 1984, by allowing natal men to be housed with natal women. Provisions within national instruments regarding the rights of women in prison are being breached, and I have provided supporting evidence for that. Question 8. How is Australia's failure to meet its obligations pursuant to CEDAW impacting on the women you know or assist? A, discrimination. Excuse me. Article 2 of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women calls for states to condemn discrimination against women in all its forms and lays out 6 subsections for this article. All of these subsections in Article 2 could be applied to women prisoners, but the only one that specifically and solely focuses on women prisoners is subsection G. It calls for all national penal provisions which constitute discrimination against women to be repealed. Discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people, especially on the grounds of ethnicity, age, sex, or disability. Unjust actions are defined as not based on what is morally right and fair. B, incarcerating women is, in and of itself, an act of discrimination against women. Considering what we know about the number of incarcerated women suffering from traumatic brain injury, acquired brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, poor mental health, depression, histories of sexual and physical violence and injury, child sexual assault at the hands of men, the act of arresting women, the act of sentencing women to serve time in a penal facility, and the act of incarcerating women are forms of direct discrimination, which other forms of direct, indirect, and compounding discrimination stem from to then develop into ongoing forms of direct, indirect, and compounding discrimination. Ongoing discrimination. We know that incarcerated women struggle more than incarcerated men when re-entering society and their community post-release. Making ongoing discrimination and barriers re-entering society even more difficult to overcome is the fact that the age of most female prisoners in Australia is at a point in life where these women would otherwise, hopefully, be focused on education, career, family, and or other interests and goals. Most female prisoners were aged between 25 and 39. That was 54%. The median age was 34. Considering what has already been covered in my witness statement relating to the unique, complex, and compounding vulnerabilities of women in prison, we can speculate that women continue to experience direct, indirect, and compounding discrimination in an ongoing pattern after incarceration. Loss of custody of children, trouble finding employment and stable housing, entering unhealthy relationships, and many other barriers face women upon exiting prison. These compounding issues feed the problem of rising recidivism rates amongst Australian women.
Could we just hold you there for one moment? Thank you so much, because your submission is extremely detailed, Jessica, and we would like to ask some questions if we could, so that we've certainly read your whole submission and you've got a list of recommendations at the end. But I'm just hoping that we might be able to spend the next, because we've got another 10 minutes. Did you have questions, Mary or Helen or Kerry?
Yes, I did. So Jessica, you mentioned obviously these women that are in prison and obviously suffering from a lot of issues. I'm guessing, and I wouldn't know, but is there any data around services that are implemented within prisons that assist women?
Yes, there are some programs that are offered inside, within incarcerated, within those terms of incarceration. However, we do know that funding and resources are primarily directed to men and male prisons. So even when there are programs, they're usually understaffed and under-resourced and underfunded.
Right.
That was the same question I was looking at.
Okay, I got another question. How do you feel about, and I don't know about America, but in Australia, when, say, a woman that's pregnant and she's in the prison system, how do you feel about a woman obviously not being able to leave to have or to raise a child outside because she's been sentenced or she's about to be sentenced and she's kept there, and they, I don't know if they have a ward. I'm guessing they would have a ward in some prisons.
Yes, so there are either wards or actually whole facilities designated for pregnant women and nursing women and their babies and their children, depending on what age that specific facility will allow the child to remain with the mother. That does vary. Ideally, there would never be a pregnant woman or a mother behind bars and separated from her child. That is absolutely what should be the aim of any state or federal government. However, while we are still seeing this happen, we should be making every attempt possible to prioritize the mother-baby bond and to do everything to facilitate that bond to remain whole. When we separate children from their mothers, we know, and there is historic evidence to support the knowledge, that we are creating cycles of abuse, potential criminality, and other, shortcomings throughout life for those children.
I'd like to ask a question about solitary confinement.
Yes.
I'm aware it's used differently for men and for women. Can you just elaborate on what you're aware of in dealing with women who have to or are moved to solitary confinement?
Certainly, I can give personal testimony to what happened to women while I was incarcerated, and I saw what I witnessed was prison guards and officers using the threat of solitary confinement as intimidation, as a tool to get the women to back down or to be quiet or to drop their complaint, whatever the particular case might be. They were often taken to solitary confinement for attitude adjustments, in the exact words of the prison guards, whereas men present many security issues within men's prisons and violent situations. So I'd assume while there is manipulation and mishandling of solitary confinement within men's prisons, absolutely, that there would also be a much more justification of that, of solitary confinement for practical purposes as well.
I've got one about suicide, because
Yes.
what we know from the statistics is that I think it shows that men are more likely than women to commit suicide in prison, but women are more likely than men to commit suicide when they've left prison. Have you got any knowledge or statistics or research on that issue?
I wouldn't want to speak on the issue of post-release suicide attempts, because although I do have some knowledge, I do not have enough knowledge where I feel I should be speaking on that. However, I would say that in general, not within the context of incarceration, but in general, we know that evidence suggests that when men make attempts at suicide, they are much more violent in their attempts, whereas women make more passive attempts. So perhaps that pattern is somehow reflected in that. But yeah, I wouldn't feel comfortable speaking much more on that. I would certainly be in a position to submit evidence at a future date and take that on notice if that's something that you would appreciate.
That would be helpful, because, I mean, what would be really helpful if we had research that showed that when women were released from prison, that there were proper supports in the community for them. Because if they are committing suicide when they leave prison, and I respect that you don't want to address that issue specifically, it is highly likely that the supports are simply lacking. We know there is a lack of support for men released from prison, but because there are so many fewer women in prison, the services for women are likely to be more minimal.
So what I can speak to here very confidently is the stigma that and the discrimination, and it is actually included in my witness statement. I'm not sure if I'll be allowed to read the rest of that. I do hope to, but if not, I understand. But women face a lot more discrimination than men do upon release, and when they're re-entering society, applying for jobs, and possibly trying to retain custody of their children. We do know that programs to support prisoners in general need to improve, and that is much more evident when it comes to the support for women in and after prison. That is absolutely true. I could certainly, based on my experience and my knowledge, see how women would feel so distressed, distraught, and hopeless upon release that they would turn to such a horrible act. Yes.
Yeah, good. I think the difficulty is that we've got our next witness coming at 12 noon, but perhaps if I just say that we note that your paragraph C was on recidivism rates, paragraph D addressing male violence in practical ways, the failures and successes, and then the answer to question 9, what needs to change now and how can these changes best be achieved? Human rights practice you've referred to, women-centred policy and law. And what I was coming to was perhaps if you could take us through your recommendations, and then we'll conclude on that note. But rest assured that we've read the submission, we'll take the whole of it into account, and we can, if you would allow us to come back with any further questions we have for you, that would be appreciated.
Great. I would love to read my recommendations out. I'll go ahead and start on that if that's okay.
Thanks so much.
Great. So in answer to number 10, what recommendations would you like the CEDAW Committee to make? Ratify and implement the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Incarcerated Girls and Women. ratify the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, the Nelson Mandela Rules, ratify and implement the Australian Government Guidelines on the relief and support of girls and women exiting the sex trade in Australia, implement provisions and methods within demands for change, ending male violence against women and children, legislate a ban on strip searching and body cavity searches of women prisoners, and legislate the use of electronic body scanning technology, legislate the requirement of states to overhaul penal systems to become more similar to open or progressive prison systems, define the incarceration of women and girls as a form of discrimination, often incorporating violence, that must be phased out as far as is practical and possible. Prioritize preserving the mother, baby, or child bond above active sentences for women. Delegate to state governments the undertaking of more research in relation to the causes of and remedies for recidivism in women prisoners. Delegate to state and federal government the undertaking of more research into the causes of the recent decrease in the number of female prisoners in Australia. Undertake an urgent inquiry into the circumstances of all women in prison who have been involved in the death of a partner or former partner, including all women now held in prison on charges alleging they were violent against a husband or former male partner in all states and territories. As a matter of urgency, review how the tightening of bail laws, use of mandatory sentencing, and the shift for longer sentences for drug offences are all affecting the rise in incarceration rates for Australian women. And lastly, as a matter of urgency, look into the recurring issues in New South Wales in regard to poor record keeping and other occurrences of poor practices in relation to data collection within relevant Australian, state and federal government departments. Thank you.
Helen, Dr. Pringle, you didn't have a chance to ask a question.
I just have one quick question about two of those. These are number 3 and 4, and these are both your proposals. Is that right?
Yes, the first, third, and fourth are proposals that I have worked on over the past few years, and they are ready for governments to take on board and either implement or ratify in whole.
That's right. So I just want to. It wasn't quite clear to me from especially on 3 whether that there were the guidelines. They were Australian government guidelines, which already existed somewhere, and I sort of thought that can't be right. But and I realised it was your work, and then I just.
That's the hope one day.
But I'll just say that I think that would be a really important thing to look at, that pipeline or links between the sex trade, prisons, stigma, violence, etc.
Yes.
That I think that's really important.
I really wanted to at least make that connection in one area of my statement to hopefully have that pathway of thought and action embedded in my statement. Yes.
Yeah, that would be. I think that I'd find that really wonderful and impressive. And, yeah. So I haven't read your work yet, but I just saw it. But I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, thank you for doing that too, Jessica.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I just hope it can make a difference.
No, it's a really important aspect of this, and also thinking of the situation in the Northern Territory as well. I know how crucial that is.
Yes.
Indigenous women in particular.
Yes.
But others as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Just to clarify then, we've got a copy of all your annexures, and I'm taking in the annexures, which we haven't had an opportunity to read yet, the recommendation number 3, to which Dr. Pringle referred, the headline here, or the title here, Australian Government Guidelines on the Relief and Support of Girls and Women Exiting the Sex Trade in Australia, proposal. That's your title, and it's a document that or guidelines that you have produced, which you are seeking the Australian government to ratify and implement.
Yes, and if I can put on record that there have been some federal senators that have shown quite a bit of interest in that document. I've hit some barriers with some other politicians, But yes, that is my document that I put together.
Good. And then also to follow up with Dr. Pringle's question, then in 4, implement provisions and methods within quote or title, demands for change, ending male violence against women and children. That also is your document based on your research, and you were saying that this is what the Australian government and all state governments in control of prisons and women in prison and so forth should implement these.
Yes, exactly. And that's the same for the first one as well, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Incarcerated Girls and Women. That is also a document that I have put together along with some help from the International Network for Incarcerated Girls and Women, which I lead.
Oh, so the first one is not, the first one is your proposal as well?
Yes.
Oh, very good. Oh, okay.
And so is work going on to get that before the United Nations so that it
Yes.
becomes, yeah, good.
But number
I'm
two,
trying.
number 2 is already, the Nelson
Yes,
Mandela
yes,
already.
and I apologize for the confusion of that order. But yes, so just to be very clear, 1, 3, and 4 are my proposals that I created. One of those being in conjunction with the International Network for Incarcerated Girls and Women, and 2 is already a United Nations, the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the Nelson Mandela rules.
That's splendid. So thank you so much for coming, Jessica. We really appreciated having you as a witness here. And if I can quickly say, I do criminology and criminal justice at the University of Buckingham, and I'm going to have to get you on sometime on Teams. It might be the early morning hours for you, but it'd be wonderful to have you. So thank you very much.
I would be absolutely honored. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you.
I thank you very much for this opportunity. I really hope my statement and extra do some good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.